Hello astronauts, I'm Spaceface Dev, and today I want to talk about game scope in our newest episode of Get Good Game Dev. Someone might ask, but what is Get Good Game Dev? And my answer would be a YouTube series full of arbitrarily lumped together episodes relating to game development. Yeah. Now, tons of great channels have already discussed the concept of scope in depth, so I want to focus largely on a particular piece of the discussion that I feel doesn't get discussed enough. Game scope in regards to context. But for those of you who don't know what game scope is altogether, I'll quickly summarize it. Normally, in the pre-production phases of development, as in when the development team is formulating their game idea, and sometimes but rarely even further along, people have to come up with, of course, ideas. And this is where scope comes into play, especially for newer and indie developers. Scope is simply the magnitude of the workload needed to complete the final product, and in turn the magnitude of the final product itself. For instance, a 3D dungeon crawler with 1,000 levels, hundreds of unique enemies, and a multitude of bosses would often be considered a product with large scope. Generally, the best course of action when creating a game is to keep the scope as small as possible, and to create a minimum viable product. The goal when doing this is to remove everything that doesn't support the game's overarching purpose, so taking out unnecessary features that may sound cool, but don't exactly help you reach the intended final goal, or the game's intended final purpose. That way, the game is completed with more elegant design, and also makes it a lot easier to actually finish the game. A great idea is of no use to anyone if it is never put into action. Scoping down means less work to meet the end goal, and hence makes it easier to meet the end goal in a reasonable amount of time. But I think when considering the context of how certain mechanics or general ideas can be formulated into the game itself, a game with a large scope can quickly become a lot smaller. Take our initial example, for instance. A 3D dungeon crawler with 1,000 levels, hundreds of unique enemies, and a multitude of bosses. This sounds large until you begin to describe how procedural generation, for example, would be used to turn, let's say, 50 preset rooms combined with up to 30 variations of enemy waves with enemy statistics being randomized to create 1,000 unique levels. Suddenly, what was originally a ton of work became simply a lot less work, and in turn, you began to decrease the game's scope. That in itself is game scope in regards to context. However, I don't want the use of context when determining the scope of a game to sound like an easy solution to make a big idea smaller while still meeting the initial criteria. It still requires a ton of work. This actually led to a massive flop just a few years ago, regarding a game most of you probably still remember, No Man's Sky. Yes, I know, it has gotten a lot better recently, but that doesn't erase its failures from history. The initial goal or criteria was to create a massive, endless universe for players to explore, with tons of unique creatures for players to find. Now, this might sound familiar beyond just knowledge of the game. The example we used to describe game scope in regards to context was very similar, as they both used context regarding procedural generation to turn a lot of stuff into a lot less stuff, which didn't end too well in No Man's Sky's case. Also, I want to be very clear. I'm not trying to say that the use of procedural generation in games is a horrible replacement for building every aspect of a game by hand. It is amazing. I'm just using it in this example in particular. Changing the game's scope through context is a tool used in numerous games, whether that is Battle Chef Brigade, turning what could have been complicated cooking mechanics into a Match 3 game, or the awesome GMTK 2019 Game Jam entry, Heart of Bronze, which turned what could have been numerous items, menus, and so much more into a much smaller creation. pretty much turning anything that would have required a lot of work to implement into something much smaller by implementing it intelligently, by considering the goal of the game's mechanics and the game and/or mechanics scope. Nonetheless, I can't think of a single game I've ever played that did it better than Minute. This game plays, at least from my experiences, like any other indie adventuring game. Travel around the map, find hidden objects that grant you new abilities, and hence accessibility to a previously inaccessible area or areas, and so on and so forth. However, the game really, if it wasn't for a single mechanic, is maybe around 5 to 10 minutes long, tops. That is because every time you spawn, you have 1 minute until you die again. In that time, you adventure and explore and get as much done as you can with the information gathered in a previous run. In turn, a very small game turns into an hour-long experience, if not longer. It is fun, engaging, and often accomplishes the game's initial goal of a complete adventure full of exploration without, well, it really only taking 5 minutes at the same time. Additionally, it does well to make sure the game doesn't feel too grindy or too repetitive, despite how grindy and repetitive it actually might be at times. Of course, like any game, Minute has its issues, but this isn't a video about reviewing games, so I'll end it here. Game scope, in regards to context, at its core is a useful way of thinking about the scope of your games, by considering how a massive idea can be turned into something a lot more manageable simply by thinking it through. Thank you to my Patreon supporters, Tiger J and AI, for all of your support, and a big thank you to everyone who stayed until the very end of the video. I'll see you all later.